Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, August 24th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Bob Hansen of Briess Malt Ingredients Company joins us to talk about a big topic, how to brew high-gravity beers. Bob gave a session at, well, you guessed it, the National Homebrewers Conference in Orlando called Going Big, Life After 1064. We recently caught up with Bob, and he shared a lot of great information. So let's get right to it, shall we? Well, Bob Hansen, welcome again to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks, James. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, either recorded or not.
Well, we got to meet in person for the first time down in Orlando, and you were one of the guys on my list to get an interview down there, but our schedules didn't mesh, and but luckily, due to the wonders of the telephone, we're able to get you today.
Well, I kind of wish I was back in Orlando, but...
Well, it's a nice area of the country down there. Hard to cool down your wort, but a nice area of the country.
Right. Well, especially that week with all the good beer that was there.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. Now, the title of your presentation was Going Big, Life After 1064, or 1.064, and I'm assuming that's referring to the original gravity of these beers. What is magic about 1064?
It's not just I wouldn't say there's necessarily a magic about it. It's really the point, I think, at which there start to be some technical challenges to producing the beers, and that you need to do maybe put a little more thought and a little more formulation into making them so that you can, make them successfully.
So big beers it goes beyond just adding more ingredients to get a good beer at that gravity?
Well, there's all sorts of subtle things that change, with different amounts of original gravity. And as you just alluded to, different amounts of grain that are used in your system. Sometimes it's just making sure that the stuff, all your grain that you're trying to pack in there will actually fit. And what I tried to do in the presentation is just give some, simple calculations or ideas on adjustments to make so that you can make sure that it fits, that you're getting the correct amount of specialty malts, that you're getting the proper degree of fermentability out of the beer that you want. Some of the limitations that you face are recipe related, some are equipment related, some are fermentation related. And as the degree of largeness of the beer grows, I think the challenges and the adjustments that need to be made from what is normal increase.
Now, before we get into the pitfalls, what are the typical styles, or the styles that are typically known as big gravity beers? Well,
I think everybody knows of the real famous ones, the ones that grab all the attention. I mean, things like barley wines, double box, historically Belgian triples or quadruples or quintuples or whatever the flavor of the day is, or the latest, greatest, American craft definition of taking regular styles and calling them imperial and making them big. So, I mean, there are things like IPAs or red ales that, if brewed to be a really big beer, are then called imperial IPAs. But then there's also some, what you would almost consider lighter styles, things like saisons, lambics, that can also fit into the style, and even some lighter high gravity beers, things like Maibach, that are lighter in color. Just like the rest of the beer spectrum, big beers comprise both ales and lagers, light to dark, bitter to non-bitter, and there's quite a range of products that fit in there.
So it's these big beers, these high gravity beers, don't have to be syrupy. They don't have to be heavy and like maybe an imperial something or other. They can be kind of a lighter tasting beer.
Sure, and that's and lighter in body. That's one of the challenges. Is that whenever you start with that much, when you have a wort that you make from barley malt, 100% malt, in the case of say a barley wine or a double bock, it has a limit. Malt has a certain degree of fermentability that it normally doesn't go above, so you end up with a lot of residual sugars and sweeteners, and some of the big beers are, frankly, quite syrupy, especially some of the ones you think of, barley wine and double bock. But some of especially the Belgian styles, where either using candy sugar or honey, are fairly light in body. I mean, Saison can finish at as low as 10-10. However, it'll end up being almost 8% alcohol, but it will be perceived as very light and fruity. That's always been one of my problems with the Belgian style blonde ales and some of the doubles, is that they taste so good, and they seem very light, and then they catch up with you later.
They are pretty easy to drink. What can go wrong if you don't pay attention to the details that we're going to talk about? What are some of the effects that you can get out of doing a high-gravity beer incorrectly? Well,
we've already mentioned, getting syrupy sweetness. Sometimes if you don't, if you just make a recipe bigger by doubling the recipe, you'll end up with a higher percentage of specialty grains than you want, and maybe too dark of a color. A lot of times the limitations are in the brew house are just things having to do with the different way that water and the proportion of water and the grain react in things like, all of a sudden you may find if you double in the amount of grain you put in, it just simply doesn't fit anymore. And you can then make some adjustments for that by trying to reduce the liquor to grist ratio, but that may end up making the wort very slow to run off, which can lead to a very long brew day.
Or a stuck sparge if everything goes wrong.
Yeah, or a stuck sparge. It's I never give up on them, so they just ends up to be a very long day. They get stuck, and then it just takes patience. But or a lot of brewers that try and just use their normal system end up with a very low initial gravity, or not low, but they get maybe 1060 when they're trying to get to 1080, and then they're stuck at work boiling for 4 hours, or they're steaming up their entire house boiling for 4 hours trying to concentrate their wort down, during which time they're consistently darkening the wort. So if you're trying to make, for example, a very light Saison or a light-colored high-gravity beer, which is, I think, a real challenge, if you end up boiling it for a very long time, you're going to end up with a lot of color, and it's not going to turn out the way you want. And it's not, that you'll fail miserably. It's just that in order to get the beer, and everybody usually wants, I know I do, wants the beer to turn out the way they intended. That's usually how I judge my success. And it's good to just have a little tricks and adjustments to make when brewing high gravity to make sure, because there are some subtleties in the process, whether it's the extent of the boiling or the sheer amount of grain and mash that can kind of sneak up on you.
Well, let's start with a mash. I did my first triple the other day, and had almost 18 pounds of grain in my 10-gallon cylindrical cooler. And by the time mash out came along, you're right. It fit, but I could tell that if I'd had a lot more, a few more pounds of grain, that was going to be a challenge in fitting all of that in the cooler. So I guess if you're talking about the mash, the size of your mashing vessel may be your first consideration, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, it gets a bit complex because you need to consider things like your yield to figure out your grain bill. But the first challenge is just simply is your equipment going to be big enough for the task at hand? If you're brewing a normal gravity beer, say a 1050, I think is probably about an average, and you want to all of a sudden go up to a 1080 or an 1100. Well, if you're already 2/3 full, your mash vessel or whatever vessel you're using for mashing or conversion, odds are that it may not fit if you're going to double the amount of basically the wort gravity if you go from say 50 gravity points to 100. So it's important to consider first just the volume of the material that you're going to need, the amount of grain, that is, the actual pounds, and then the volume of that once you mash it in.
Of course, one solution would be to do, say, a 2.5 gallon batch of beer instead of a 5 gallon. There's no rule or law that says you have to do beers in 5 gallon increments.
That's right, and that's one of the ways that smaller brewers will be able to make batches of big beers. But of course, usually the big beers, they require extended aging. They're a lot of work, and they're delicious. So you always want to make as much as you can. At least I do. In fact, I had a double saison that I had at the AHA conference that I made, and I unfortunately just drank the last bottle 2 nights ago. I was wishing the batch was a little bit bigger. But yeah, you're right. One of the easy ways to get around that is, simply to, make a smaller amount, because then it's going to fit. Other solutions are adjusting your process. You can lower your liquor to grist ratio, or that is the amount of water you add per pound of grain, pounds of water per pounds of grain. However, there's a limit to how little water you can add. You actually have to get it to mash and convert, and getting below, I would say, maybe 2 pounds of water for 1 pound of grain is, once you start to get below that level, a 2.0 liquor to grist ratio, it gets pretty hard to mash and separate. Another solution is just simply to boost your gravity at some other point in the process, either by adding extract or adding sugars or other liquid adjuncts. And I know some people have feelings about using extracts, but that's actually one of the common ways that small or regional sized breweries will be able to brew their big beers. That's one of the biggest uses that we see of malt extract, is just for people who are trying to boost their gravity. They'll get their wort and their process through up to 16 Plato or 1064, and then if they're trying to go to 1080, they'll just add a little bit of extract to boost it. So there's lots of different solutions and ways to brew big beers. Some of them just require that you take into consideration, again, your desired target for your beer.
Now, let's talk about the liquor to grist ratio, or the water to grain ratio. And you're talking in pounds of water to pounds of grain. I'm used to thinking about it in quarts of water to pounds of grain. What is the minimum amount of water that you have to get in there with the grain to make things work, and what are what are the compromises that you may run into? Get into a bit of the technical aspects of that.
Sure. Well, and there's, to start off, liquor to grist ratio is there's all sorts of ways to measure it. Some that are used by professional brewers in the United States, some that are used in Europe, and some that are used by home brewers. It's a bit unfortunate that some of the things aren't standardized, even like original gravity. Is it, do you measure it in Plato, or do you measure it in specific gravity? But it's fairly easy usually to convert. In the case of liquor to grist ratio, when I say pounds of grain, it's important to realize that a gallon is 8.34 pounds. So 1 quart then is going to be roughly 2 pounds, just as a ballpark, and as an exact number, it's 2.09. So maybe about 2.1 pounds. So if you're used to working then in quarts per gallon, or quarts per pound, a quart per pound would equate to a liquor to grist ratio of 2.1. So if you start to get down, I would say less than 0.9 quarts per pound, you're going to start to get really pretty thick mashes. And I always try to be quantitative when I talk about some of the things that are good or bad in the brewing process. So if you look at how that can affect your beer, you'll find that thicker mashes have a lower pH, which can helps to stabilize the enzymes, which is oftentimes good. That can create more free amino nitrogen and more soluble nitrogen, up to 10 to 20%. So big beers are obviously usually not lacking in any means in free amino nitrogen. It also helps to increase your alpha amylase survival time. So you can see, though, that because it's so thick, you'll start to reduce enzyme mobility, and you just won't quite get the degree of fermentability or conversion that you might normally get, which, if you're making a big beer, can compound the other problem that you might have later on in trying to get a low finish gravity or lower finish gravity. In other words, if you're starting with a barley wine and you go with a super thick mash and it reduces your fermentability a little bit, you're already going to have a lot of residual dextrins just because you have so much wort solids in there, and then having a thick mash can then exacerbate that. So that, it's not uncommon that if you don't quite get it right, you can get finished gravities of like 1040. It'll end up being pretty syrupy. So, however, the quantifying that effect, you'll only see about maybe a 5% reduction in fermentability by having a really thick mash. But it's just one of those little things, is that if you're it's something to think about when you're making a very low liquor to grist ratio, something on the order of, say, 0.8 or 0.9 quarts per pound. It is important, though, that liquor to grist ratio kind of sets your initial wort strength. In other words, you get a certain amount of extract from each pound of grain, and you have a certain amount of water in your mash. That's your liquor to grist ratio. With that, your first wort strength, that is the strongest wort you will ever collect off that mash, is already set. So, in the case of 1 quart per pound, you would have a first wort strength of somewhere in the neighborhood of 1090 to 1100. Okay, so pretty strong first worts, which is good when you're making a big beer. However, if you had it up at twice that, 2 quarts per pound, you would be looking at a maximum wort strength. That is, the first wort you would get off your lauter ton of only about 1.06. So and that's the strongest you're going to get before sparging. So you can see from that, if you're starting at, if your target is 1080 and you're starting at 1060 with your strongest wort, you're going to need to do quite a bit of boiling or do something else to get that gravity up. So somewhere in between that, I would say that range, 0.8 to 0.9 is probably as low of that is quarts per pound, is about as low of a liquor to grist ratio you can go to and still have a mash that is manageable from a thickness and a conversion point of view, and that'll give you a very strong first worts on the neighborhood of 1100.
But again, you might have less fermentables.
Yeah, and quantifying that, it might affect it by 5%. Part of it is just getting. It will help to go with a low liquor to grist ratio to get the material in, because obviously there's that much less water and volume to fit in your mash vessel. It's just that you can imagine if in the extreme case you went to like 0.5 quarts per pound or something like that, the grain would be kind of like a big wet compost pile. There's just not enough stuff in there to get anything done.
And I have to apologize to our listeners who email me on a regular basis saying, "Don't forget us metric users."
Well, that's the nice thing about the liquor to grist ratio is that it's when I use it in pounds of water per pounds of grain, it translates. It's unitless. It's pounds divided by pounds. So that's also it's also kilograms per liter. That's why I think it's the best unit to use for liquor to grist. You can use pounds per barrel and et cetera, but when you actually say a liquor to grist ratio of pounds per pounds, it's also kilograms per liter. So, it translates directly from English to metric units. It's just a weight per weight unit of water to grain. So
there you go.
There you have it, metric. That's an easy conversion.
Cool. Well, maybe I won't get emails now.
I think you will.
Now you asked the question in your presentation, to sparge or not to sparge.
Right. The cliché's already there, so I might as well finish it off. That is the question. Brewers, especially homebrewers. I know when I started, I've been homebrewing for over 16 years. I was always caught up in doing everything right and thought I had to do everything right. And one of the things is, you think you got to do, well, you got to get you got to sparge, you got to get a good yield from your grain. But really, sparging has a couple of effects. One is it helps you get your yield out of the grain. But the other thing is it dilutes your wort.
Mm-hmm.
And some brewers have advocated for big beers a no sparge method. Now, where that can reduce your yield from your grain and exacerbate the problems maybe of fitting your mash into your mash vessel, because you'll actually need more grain because your yield will be lower, it can help you to keep a very high strength wort so that you can limit your boiling time. For light colored beers, the largest source of color is actually the boiling process. So if you're trying to make a very light, high-gravity beer, keeping that boil time to a very reasonable amount, 60 minutes or less, will really help to make a light beer. And in order to do that, you must have a very strong wort. So, the great thing about homebrewers is you don't necessarily have to make money making your beer. And in fact, if you do, you're probably in trouble.
Yeah, you get caught.
Right. So you can simply use more grain and not sparge, and you won't have as long of a brew day because you won't be boiling so long, and you'll end up making a lighter beer. And honestly, too, especially near the end of the sparging process, I would say below specific average of 1.016. You're starting to collect a lot of coloring compounds and other things that, honestly aren't helping the quality of your beer, but industrial brewers need to capture that wort because it's either yield or it's waste down the sewer that they have to, pay BOD for. But home brewers, that's really, there's not very much economic value in there. I've learned when I homebrewed not to, sparge nearly as much as I used to because I'm not as concerned about getting a big yield out. And sometimes with big beers you need to make sacrifices on doing everything right. And by not sparging, you can have possibly a higher quality product, have one that's easier to make in your system, and have a shorter day, which, I think everybody appreciates that.
Sure. So you're keeping an eye more on the gravity rather than the volume. So using no sparge, you might end up collecting a little bit less wort, but if it's at your target gravity, that's what you're looking at? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. In fact, if you just take a normal mash and you were to just drain it completely without sparging, you would actually have at least 70% of the extract that you would get out of there normally, without sparging at all. Most of your extract is caught up in your first worts and what's in the original mash. So if you just eliminate the spars, you can still get a fairly decent yield. It won't be like it's nothing.
All right, let's move on. Now that we've let's say we've collected our wort, and we're moving on to the kettle.
Well, I think this is one of the areas where I think a few tricks or a couple ideas can help, and of course they need to be based on the mash earlier, because that's bringing into the kettle what you have. But I think one of the things that most people who do all-grain brewing of big beer start off with is they start off, well, I'll just make a normal wort, and then I'll boil the crap out of it, to get to the gravity I want. There's a couple problems with that. One is, if you start with, say you're trying to get to 1080, and you start with a 1040 wort, you're going to have twice as much in the beginning. You're basically, you're going to have to boil half of it away. So you're going to need to have twice as much in your kettle. Well, it might not necessarily fit to have that much in. And then additionally, boiling, even though it seems, pretty safe and normal, and brewers love to do it, excessive boiling really isn't good for a beer. It creates a lot of color development. Like I said, for light-colored beers, the biggest source of color development is the kettle boil and the whirlpool time, the time that the wort spends near those boiling temperatures. It's even more important than the color of the grain. That is, if you start with, say, a really light, like a Pilsen malt, you can make an 8 Plato wort a specific gravity of 1032 that'll only have a 1 Lovibond color, or a 1064 with a 2 Lovibond color, a nice light wort. But by the end of the boiling process, especially if you have a long boil, that lightest wort you could make, which the grain is only making at 2 Lovibond, could be as high as 10 or 12. You'll, instead of making your Belgian-style golden ale, you've just made some sort of amber.
Wow.
So having the right gravity in the kettle and keeping that kettle boil to a reasonable amount is very important if you want to make a light-colored, high-gravity beer. Additionally, like I said, excessive boiling, it wastes your time as a brewer. It angers your wife or your husband or your children as you fill the entire house with steam and create a sauna out of your kitchen. And the colors and flavors that you are generating aren't necessarily the best in terms of flavor stability or even in terms of their true flavor. And some, I think we've all made or had high-gravity beers that have been boiled forever that, are kind of vegetable-y and just, don't have a real good flavor to them. So the biggest thing in the kettle is, realizing that, the kettle boil is not independent of the finished product. So that, we talked a little bit about getting higher gravity worts or having a higher gravity wort in the kettle. If you start with say a 1048, a normal gravity beer, and you have, say, a 10% evaporation, if you want to get to, say, 1080, you'll be boiling that for, almost 5 or 6 hours.
Wow.
Which will do a couple things. One is because you started so low, you won't have very much when you're done, and also you'll have a very dark color. I showed a graph in my presentation, which was, what the graph was starting with a certain original gravity, either 1040 all the way up to 1096, and boiling that until you got to 1100. And what it showed was that if you started with, say, 10 gallons at 10 Plato, if you started at 20 gallons at 10 Plato, by the time you got up to your target gravity, not only would you have half as much, but the color would be on the order of 17. Where if you started, because of the length of your boil, would be almost 4 hours. So you just made, essentially almost a dark beer. Where if you started with a very high gravity wort and only boiled for a normal amount of time, you could actually make a beer of, say, 1090 or 1100 that would be a 5 or a 6 color. And it would, again, have a good and normal flavor. Also, if excessive kettle boils, you'll actually end up starting to reduce your hop utilization. And if you're boiling at a very high gravity, you also need to realize that your hop utilization will be lower than what it will be in a more dilute wort. So, for example, high gravity beers can have 25 to 30% lower hop utilization, and then if you end up boiling it for 4 hours, that can even suffer some more.
So we've talked about the effect of the density of the wort on hop utilization, but we haven't talked about the length of the boil having an effect on utilization. How does that work?
Well, basically, if you boil it for say up to 90 minutes, you're that whole time, from 0 to 90, you're increasing the amount of BUs that you're extracting.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there becomes a point of no return. You're isomerizing as many as you're destroying, and you'll actually start to get a slight decrease.
Really?
I guess it's important to note that you're not getting better utilization by boiling for 3 hours. It's not like it keeps increasing, off the chart of what's in the normal homebrew book. Beyond that amount of time, it's not a large amount that you decrease, but you'll actually start to be on the downside, and you'll start to see a decrease in hop utilization with boils, say, longer than an hour and a half in terms of getting your BUs out of it, your bittering units. Of course, you have absolutely no aromatics left whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
But then also because of the thickness of the wort and the complexities of trying to dissolve that much stuff in water, the hops do not isomerize as good as normal. So that from a normal gravity beer to, say, a 1050 beer to a beer that's 1100, you can see a 25% loss in utilization. So you would then have to increase the hops that you're using if you're going to have a high gravity wort to start with.
Now, what about, we've been talking about all grain so far, but what if you are an extract brewer? What are the challenges, or what are the considerations that you've got to be thinking of?
Well, extract, and whether it's extract or adjuncts or liquid adjuncts or sugars, that's one area where, again, one of the things I learned right away as homebrew was, sugar is bad. But when I started, brewing high gravity beers, especially real good ones, I learned that, sugar was good. When you're making a beer that's 1040 or 1050, and you put in a couple pounds of sugar so that it's much more highly fermentable, the beers can be thin and cidery. However, when you're making a really big beer, you're not trying to make the beer, you're no longer usually struggling to get the beer malty enough or to have enough body or mouthfeel in it. More often you're struggling to get the finish gravity down so that it's not cloyingly sweet and syrupy thick. And sugars are one way to do that. So that high gravity beers, several of them, especially the Belgians, which I think are some of the more drinkable of the high gravity beers, sugar is a standard practice. Other than just sugar, then malt extract for high gravity beers lends itself well to high gravity beers. So, for example, you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls of the mashing and worrying about packing that much grain into your process simply by formulating your recipe, removing a portion of the base malt and substituting that with a very light extract. At that point, you can actually just run through a normal brew day that you would normally do, and just like your normal process where everything fits and you make a nice original gravity wort of 1050 or 1060, what you're used to making, and then you can supplement with extract to get your gravity up. to the level that you need. And this is where, like I said, even we see regional breweries using extract, simply because it allows them to get a full fermenter full of beer that is a full batch size, and they can manage it the way they manage a normal brew. Also, the extract, malt extract has gone through an extensive boiling and evaporation period, so it really doesn't need to go through extended kettle boil for DMS volatilization or anything like that. It really just needs to be sterilized. So that oftentimes what people will do is they'll run through a normal brew, they'll throw their hops in at the normal gravity, they'll get very good utilization, just go for a regular 60 or 90 minute boil, they won't worry about boiling it too long, and then they'll add the extract near the end to boost the gravity up. That way, because most of the time that it's boiling, it has a lower gravity, it has less color development, has better hop isomerization. They're still using the all-grain portion. They're getting the required volatilization and everything else done that they need to, and then they just supplement at the very end to boost the gravity up. And you can see that allows you to avoid a lot of the pitfalls. Now, whether that's done with malt, if you do that with malt extract, you'll have the same degree of fermentability as a normal all malt wort. If you're doing it with highly fermentable sugars, be it honey, Belgian candy sugar, or even sucrose, table sugar, that'll help to lower your finish gravity. And a lot of, it's not just the Belgians that use sugar. I mean, you'll see it in imperial porters and imperial stouts, and really, like I said, for most big beers, highly fermentable sugars or other liquid adjuncts or malt extracts can really make for an easier brew day.
Now, what if you are a pure extract, steeping specialty grains, but just an extract, and I say just an extract brewer. I don't mean to say that.
We perpetuate these stigmas.
I don't mean to that. Maybe I should just cut that out. Because I still like, even though I do all grain, I still like to do extract brewing.
I do too. Some of the, and even if I went back to the pub industry, if I opened my own pub someday, I would still, there's a few beers that I would brew straight from extract just because it's so easy and they can be done so well.
And after you're used to spending like 6 hours on an all grain brew day, having a 3-hour extract brew day is just a breeze.
Oh yeah, well, and 6 hours for all grain is you've got it down pretty well. Usually for me they always end up being 8. And, yeah, it's funny that I meet, and we talked about this in a prior show, but people always seem to come around. The more experienced homebrewers, the guys who've been doing it a long time, they figure out a way to make great beer with it. Either supplementing it or at 100%, and then they can have more time to pick their kids up at daycare and do the stuff that I got to take care of. So.
Well, if you're trying to make a high gravity beer with extract, can you do it with a split boil, or do you have to have a full boil, a brew pot big enough to have a full boil?
Well, the problem with making a big beer with extract and not having a full 5-gallon kettle boil is, again, say you have 2 gallons. Well, now if you're starting with, say your original gravity, your target is 1100, and you're for a 5-gallon finished batch, and you only have you can only boil 2.5 gallons. Well, you're going to be then at 1200 original gravity, which is going to be so thick that when you boil it, it'll actually boil at a higher temperature. It'll boil probably at like 215. And it'll also, just because it's so concentrated, it'll develop color very rapidly, and it can develop some off flavors. Also, because it's so thick, you can get some burn on. However, as I mentioned, it's not, extract itself is already gone through, at least brewing grade extract, has gone through a kettle boil and extensive volatilization at the place where it was produced, so that, you could boil, there's no reason you'd have to put all the extract in the beginning. You could put some extract in, go through a 45-minute boil, and then put the rest in at the end, just for a few minutes to make sure that it's pasteurized prior to fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I mean,
sure.
A lot of people think, well, okay, I have to put it all in at once. Well, there's really no reason you need to put it all in the beginning. It doesn't have to go through the full kettle boil because it's already done that once when it was produced. There's 5 ations of boiling, of the kettle boil that you need to go through. They're coagulation of proteins, right? And that's already done in extract. Volatilization of off-flavor precursors like for DMS, that's already done in making extract. You've got sterilization, which still needs to be done because the extract itself is not sterile. That's the real reason you need to get it. But unlike a grain wort, it starts off at a very low micro count, so you can get by really just pasteurizing it almost. Heating it to 180 or to boiling temperatures for only a very short period of time. And then you've got caramelization for color or flavor development, which of course happened where the extract was produced, and isomerization of hops. So as a home brewer, using extract, the two you have left are sterilization and isomerization. And as long, because it's a low micro product, like I said, you can, if you just, throw the extract in at the very end and it's still boiling, or even if you dilute it with hot water and it's 180 and you leave it sit for a few minutes, that'll pasteurize it and that'll be sufficient. The thing you still need to do is get hop isomerization, which is why you have to do a kettle boil at all with extract, is you need to boil for 45 minutes to get some decent isomerization out of your hops.
Mm-hmm.
That is, unless you're using a hopped extract, in which case even that's the question. So straight extract, makes big beers really easy.
Now, let's move on to the fermenter. And I got an email from Josh in Oregon, coincidentally yesterday, said it would be nice to learn more about, as far as barley wine goes, he says, it would be nice to learn more about popular yeast strains, whether or not rousing the yeast is required, fermentation temperatures, and then he says tasty flavor hop combinations. So
sure, maybe
we can round out with the hop combinations. But what about the fermenter? What are the key points in choosing your yeast and using it to digest all those fermentables that you're going to put in there?
Well, I would say that it's the biggest possible, it's the biggest area of problems for making big beers. And actually, truly for brewing in general. I see whether it's pub brewers or home brewers, I learned as a home brewer that you just got to clean everything. And, I used to bathe in bleach and practically light myself on fire. But, then I'd throw in a smack pack without doing a culture on it. It would take, a day and a half to start fermenting. Mm-hmm. And it's really essential. That illustrates how just with a normal beer things can go wrong because, the beer would end up infected. And then the next time I'd, light my dog on fire as well. And, but really, I've come to realize through many years that obviously it's the yeast dummy. You need to have a good, healthy amount of yeast to have a successful fermentation, and that is even more so and more important with a big beer. I would say either infected batches can happen, or the beer just doesn't finish. It doesn't ferment all the way down. That's very common in big beers. And then they end up just cloyingly sweet, thick, and prone to infection because there's leftover easy to ferment sugars in there. Mm. So the keys to really making big beers and having a successful fermentation are, one is adjusting your yeast pitching rate. And there's general rules of thumb out there about 1 million cells of yeast per milliliter per degree Plato, or per 4 gravity points. That's 1 degree Plato. That's the general rule of thumb out there for determining pitching rates. Now, what that means is that your average, ale packet or smack pack, or your pitchable amount or propagator or activator, is really good for pitching a normal strength beer. that would be something, on the order of 1040 to 1060. However, when you double your gravity, you basically need to double the amount of yeast that you're putting into it.
Now, how is there an easy way for the casual home brewer, when you start talking about numbers of cells per this, that, and the other, a lot of people's eyes are going to start glazing over, especially if they haven't been brewing for a while. Is there an easy way, say, to make, if you make, say, a 1 quart starter at like 1040, is there a way to predict how many cells or, predict how much yeast you're going to get out of that, or help us out?
Well, there's a couple ways. Normally for a normal gravity beer, the kind of general rule of thumb for propagating is you need to have 1/10 to 1/20th of your finished fermenter volume in a culture, and that would be a 1020 or a 1040 culture, so that if you're going to be pitching a 5-gallon batch, normally you would want at least a 1 quart starter would probably be, for ideal fermentation, the best.
And again, we're talking in quarts and gallons. So.
It would be between a quart and a pint would be the amount that you would need. In a normal brew 5-gallon batch, you could probably get by with about a pint as a starter. And I think that's what the most common starters are. They're either, they're usually about a pint. That's what I normally do when I do them. However, for a big beer, you might need twice that, or basically you need to be pitched at about a quart. That would be about a 1/10, culture volume to fermenter volume. There is actually, kind of to put some of these numbers down. When I was doing this talk for the AHA, I went and talked to the Y Yeast guys and the White Labs guys to find out, how many yeasts per milliliter are made by using one of their smack packs or one of their propagators. I also talked to the Lallemand people for dry ale yeast to try to, get those numbers and present them in a easy-to-understand form. And I made a graph which kind of demonstrates that, kind of breaks it down so that it shows how many cultures or how many packets you'd need to do for an ale or a lager, depending on the strength of your wort. And everybody was actually in agreement about increased pitching rates, and they were in agreement on the amount of cells that they had. That basic guideline that I gave is the fundamental basis for how big they make their packs. However, they make their packs to make normal beer. They don't ever say that, well, you're going to make a normal beer, now you want, and this one packet will make a normal low gravity beer, but it'll also make a high gravity beer, because they realize themselves that, in fact, these are their guidelines that are actually presented in this chart, which are based on that rule of thumb that I told you. And the chart is one of the slides in the PowerPoint presentation. I had sent it to, actually, White Labs and Y Yeast both liked it, and I got them both copies. I don't know if they've posted it anywhere. I think they were going to maybe put their little tweaks on it. But if you go to our website and look at the PowerPoint presentation that's on there, there is a very good slide and a graph that shows how many packets or cultures or what size of a culture you need to pitch for a certain gravity beer in a 5-gallon batch. So it's broken down for homebrewers, 5-gallon batches, for whatever gravity they want to pitch at for ale or lager, and then it shows what you can use for dry ale yeast packets or activators or pitchable amounts or whatever. The other important thing, so now we've got pitching rate, which is by far the most important thing in terms of yeast. Secondarily, the yeast is going to be under a high degree of stress from all the alcohol and the osmotic stress that's there. So yeast nutrients, especially zinc, help out. And I think both Y Yeast and White Labs have little packets that you can buy of yeast nutrients, things like the servomyces, to help your fermentation along. multiple initial oxygenation steps are beneficial. Somebody, I think your email said, he asked about rousing the yeast.
Mm-hmm.
Stirring the yeast up using CO2 or something can oftentimes help a little bit to waken it back up. Some people have tried to oxygenate their beer after it's fermented for a while. That's not really a very good idea. Normally it just ends up creating off flavors and doesn't work very well. However, during the initial 24 hours of fermentation, the yeast is still in an aerobic phase, and it doesn't. Some of the complexities of high gravity brewing, because it's so thick, the oxygen doesn't dissolve as well. Plus, the yeast is, again, it's basically going through a yeast marathon, so it needs as much oxygen as it can get. So, unlike a low gravity beer, with a really high gravity beer, you can pop it open after 8 or 12 hours after you pitched it and shake it up again to try to shake some more oxygen into it, and that can help then to get a better fermentation.
Now, if you're shaking, as opposed to just infusing oxygen directly with a stone, an aeration stone,
yeah.
If it started fermenting, is there a layer of CO2 on top of the beer that if you just shake the fermenter, is it going to get much oxygen in there at that point?
Yeah, there will be a layer of CO2. You're right, and when you shake it, say after 8 or 12 hours, hopefully you get a little bit of fermentation started. You may create some foam, but I'm thinking you pull the cork off and you swirl it, and you can actually, just like the CO2 will come out when you do that, that'll also be replaced by gas going in. So it'll help. Obviously, if you've got a stone, that would be a great way to do it.
The easiest way.
A couple other points then about fermentation. One is, I did mention yeast pitching rate being critical. The other thing is that's absolutely critical, even more than nutrients and oxygenation, is proper yeast selection. And there's if you go to either Y Yeast or White Labs, they both have good websites and great information out there in terms of the alcohol tolerance of their yeasts. It's important to choose one that will be alcohol tolerant enough to make what you want. Some people, especially for the very, very big beers, the monster beers that people were trying to make, last year, 2 years ago, that when Dogfish Head and Sam Adams were going head to head, then you're really needing multiple yeast strains, and you might make choices at that point based on the flavor that you want. In other words, they end up using these crazy distilling strains that could do 23%. And could survive in that environment. However, those yeasts make such nasty flavors that you'd never want to use them for your main fermentation. So they, do initial fermentation with one yeast, and then as that one petered out, they throw in another one. Normally, you only need to do that if you're, trying to get up to like 16% alcohol or something like that. But multiple strain selection is an option, but you need to pick one that will be is alcohol tolerant enough to finish the job off that you want.
Do you have favorites?
I don't.
You probably don't want to endorse.
Exactly. And I have numbers. I have numbers memorized from one supplier because they were the main one that was around when I was working. That was Y Yeast. They were kind of the first guys around. But yeah, it's just they both make great products. I like. It depends on what you want the beer to be. There's, a bunch of good Belgian strains out there. There's, good German lager strains. Realize that with big beers you may end up producing more fruity esters than usual. So, try maybe to get a lager that's really clean if that's what you want. Most of them too will be aged for an extended period of time, which will help to smooth them out. Really, I just like the ones that work.
Now, what are to kind of close out? What are your favorite tips and tricks in making these big beers?
I would say that we've kind of covered a few of them. I would say that use of sugars and syrups, whether it's extract or other sugars. Really, it's okay in big beers. In fact, in some cases, it's the standard. I mean, in the cases of the Belgians. and they really can help relieve a lot of the problems, the equipment related to using that much grain. I think it's good to kind of plan things a little bit ahead of time. Consider some of the things we've talked about, just to make sure that you aren't taken by surprise. Proper pitching rate, as I mentioned, is really critical. The beer, and we didn't finish this off of fermentation, but you really, because the yeast is going to be under high amounts of stress, you want to do both primary and secondary fermentation. You don't want to leave the high gravity, high alcohol beer on that yeast while it's aging, because the yeast will autolyze and it'll taste terrible like vegetables. Additionally, you may find that for the very big beers, it may be difficult to get them to carbonate. In that, say you make a double bock and you go through a 1 month or 3 week fermentation, real low temperature. Then you age it for a couple months in the secondary. And then you finally get ready to bottle it. Well, at that point, the yeast is 3 months old. It's been, sitting under, 8% alcohol for that long length of time, and it may not be a lot of viability in there. So if you want to get good and consistent carbonation, sometimes it's not such a bad idea to, buy one of those the non-pitchable amount of yeast, the smaller amounts that you get from Wyeast or White Labs, and just use some of that for bottle conditioning.
And you could even use, say, like a yeast strain that you might not want to use
for your main fermentation, like a dry ale yeast packet.
Exactly. That's what I was I was trying to tiptoe around them, but yeah. No,
absolutely. Those are real economical, and at that point you're just trying to carbonate it. You're not you're not generating a lot of the finished fruity esters, and you'll probably age it after carbonating a little bit anyway. So yeah, really proper yeast selection, aeration, proper pitching rate, and then thinking about and managing your wort production to get the color and quality of product you want, and frankly the length of the brew day you want too.
Well, I hope that I know that I've learned something. I hope that others have learned too, and will feel more adventurous in getting out there and venturing into life beyond 1064.
Right. Yeah, I remember my first home brewing experiences. I first started making great beer. It was low alcohol. And then I was in college. I got the idea, well, if I can make it good at 4%, why not at 12%? And after several batches that were successfully high in alcohol but tasted very poor, I went back to my comfort zone and made regular good tasting beers, and then adventured later on into the world of high gravity. There's some really fantastic styles at higher gravity, but it does take a few tricks and adjustments to maybe get them to turn out the way that you want. And I hope some of the ramblings I've given you today will give you ideas to do that.
We appreciate your time, Bob.
Sure. Also, that presentation that I mentioned is available on our website.
And I'll put a link on our page to your page if they get lost and can't find it on Briess.com.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Great. Take care.
Thanks again to Bob Hansen of Briess Malt and Ingredients. Bob's a busy guy, so I always appreciate his taking time out to talk to us. And by the way, we'll get back to email next week when we have more time. Rather, specifically, when I have more time. Speaking of next week, I'm hoping to talk to homebrewer Raj Apte about the mysterious ginger beer plant. Also, I hope to have an update on the Long Shot Homebrew Contest being hosted by the Boston Beer Company from our buddy Rick Sellers of Pacific Brew News Radio. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, just write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can get great pricing on our DVDs and a combo deal to save you even more. In Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, We take you through the all-grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort, including step mashing and infusion mashing, fly sparging, and batch sparging in kind of a cool little interactive DVD menu kind of way where you can just choose your path and go through the... It's cool. You got to see it. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it from us online. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.